Remission en ligne. Boa noite. Eu gostaria de começar, de abrir essa mesa fazendo alguns agradecimentos e lembretes. O quarto encontro de estudos em Pierre Bourdieu é organizado pelo GEBU, Grupo de Estudos em Bourdieu. O evento conta com o apoio do Centro de Sociologia Contemporânea da Unicamp e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Sociologia da Unicamp e contou com financiamento da CAPES. O evento ocorre presencialmente no IFISH Unicamp. Nós agradecemos o apoio de todo o corpo técnico e administrativo do Instituto, e em particular a Secretaria de Eventos e a Coordenadoria Financeira. Uma parte de nosso encontro também compõe a programação da temporada França-Brasil 2025, portanto nós agradecemos também ao Consulado-Geral da França em São Paulo pela parceria. Gostaríamos de lembrar também que a editora Vozes disponibilizou um cupom de desconto especialmente para os dias do evento, que encerra amanhã, né? O cupom sem problema, é por uma boa causa. O cupom é EEPB30, né? Todo em maiúscula, e dá um desconto de 30% em todo o catálogo no site da editora. Passo agora a apresentação do nosso querido Frédéric Lebaron. Ele trabalha na École Normale Supérieure Paris-Saclay, onde também já dirigiu o Departamento de Ciências Sociais. Ele é formado em Economia e Sociologia, ingressou no grupo de Pierre Bourdieu ainda durante seu doutorado nos anos 90, quando Bourdieu estava no Collège de France. Sua colaboração com o grupo de Bourdieu e ele próprio inclui contribuições para Acte de la Recherche Fonction Sociale e para a coleção Raison d'Agir, além de um engajamento na crítica ao neoliberalismo e às reformas econômicas dos anos 90. Atualmente, seu trabalho se concentra na sociologia das elites e na sociologia econômica, enfatizando a produção social das políticas econômicas na Europa, os mecanismos de reprodução das desigualdades e, particularmente, os nexos entre as desigualdades econômicas e culturais. Ele está aqui no Brasil por meio da Cátedra Franco-Brasileira das Universidades do Estado de São Paulo, uma parceria com Michel Nicolau num projeto que se chama Classes e Classificações em Múltiplas Escalas. Frédéric Lebaron também presidiu, né, a Associação Francesa de Sociologia entre 2015 e 2017. Ele é uma das figuras mais influentes da sociologia francesa contemporânea e seu nome está consolidado entre os herdeiros intelectuais de Pierre Bourdieu, dentre os quais ele se distingue por um investimento forte na combinação de métodos quantitativos com a operacionalização da teoria dos campos. Eu gostaria de destacar também a disposição do Frédéric no que se refere à circulação global. Ele tem estreitas relações com a China, Índia, Noruega, Dinamarca e, naturalmente, com o Brasil. Esta é a 15ª vez que Lebaron nos visita. A primeira delas foi em 1998, por meio de um acordo CAPES-COFECUB, e eu destacaria que esse intenso intercâmbio com o Brasil é parte hoje da recepção brasileira do Bourdieu. Isso é indissociável, essa recepção é indissociável do trabalho de recepção de professores e de alunos brasileiros, exercido com muito profissionalismo e seriedade por Frédéric, não apenas em Saclay, mas nas instituições pelas quais ele passou anteriormente. Dito de modo bem simples e sem nenhum favor, c'est-à-dire pas flatteur, eu acredito que nossa própria pesquisa sobre Bourdieu no Brasil se liga ao trabalho do Lebaron como um desses intermediários entre Brasil e França. É uma honra lhe apresentar essa noite. Todos estamos ansiosos para ouvi-lo e aprender contigo. Obrigada.
Boa noite a todas e todos. Muito obrigado, Lidiane, pela introdução positiva demais. Unfortunately, I immediately switched to English for facility, as I said. But I hope that next year I'll be able to give presentations in Portuguese. Well, I should not say that, but I'll try. This presentation will be based on a long-going study which I lead since many years with Aikis Doan. She's a postdoctoral student currently in Rouen, but she was in Paris 1 a few years ago, and she defended there her thesis. She's working with me on a project without funding. It's a sort of project that we have, a free project in a sense, that began in the 90s for me and a bit later for IKES. And tonight's or this evening's presentation will be based mainly on two articles. One which can be seen as a vulgarized version of the research. It's a bit bizarre to begin to publish the vulgarized version of a research. I agree. Anyway, we did that in Le Monde Diplomatique. It was published in June this year and rapidly translated into various languages, including Portuguese. I've noticed that recently, and I guess that you got the presentation, so the article, I mean, in Le Monde Diplomatique. But it's also based on recent publications in a scientific journal called Finance and Society, publication which is focused on the idea of and the critique of the idea of scientization of central banks. With IKES, we have developed a particular point of view on the topic, including, of course, a lot of things relating to gender issues. But this collective research has given birth to a lot of publications, actually, since the beginning, usually in English, strangely, because central banks are clearly an object of interest for economists and social scientists, but mainly in the Anglo-Saxon sphere, including in France. I mean, often we present our research. Sorry, I have to speak louder. Wait, sorry for that. Before. Okay, sorry. So I was just explaining that most of the publications from this research are in English. Some of them begin to be to exist in other languages, but that's the good news with the publication in Le Monde Diplomatique is to allow us to diffuse some results in a much larger linguistic sphere, which for us is very important. So I don't comment, of course, the list of publication. If you want, I can come back later on variety of works which have been already published on the same data set, more or less. So that shows that with a single data set, you can do a lot. Maybe it will give you some ideas. Tonight I will, of course, first introduce the topic, show you the way I deal with it. And then I will do something that I think is quite important in this case, is to adopt immediately a very historical perspective on the subject, because I think, understand better issues relating to glass ceiling, to gender inequality in general, adopting a very systematic and careful and meticulous historical perspective. Then I will give some elements of statistics from our database on the general dynamics of directions of central banks in the 21st century, so since the year 2000 more or less. Then I will propose a typology of women central bankers, and I'll explain what I mean by central banker a bit later, but it's top one central bankers, it's leading positions that are concerned here. And I will give some elements about specific countries, including a rapid reflection on Brazil, but also on Tunisia and other countries, just to show you that in this research, we have the idea to develop also monographic elements on specific cases. And I will focus on one of those cases, which is the Governing Council of the European Central Bank, which is, of course, obviously, a very important, if not dominant, central bank. This topic, feminization of central bank, is not something that could be seen as a projection by sociologists interested by gender issues, gender inequalities in the sphere of monetary policy. It comes from the inside, actually. Gender diversity is described here. It's on the website of the ECB as a driving force for performance. So officially, appointing and empowering women in these institutions is seen as very important, and even described by Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB, current president of the ECB, French woman, as a revolution. So feminist revolution, so to speak, with an argument that I think is quite interesting. We want gender balance to be the norm now, rather than a revolution to fight later. Let's not forget that gender is one of the many dimensions of diversity. So that's part, of course, of a general movement in management, in especially Western capitalist society, towards the inclusion of diversity and new groups, and here women are at the forefront of this process. Actually, when you look at declarations by Christine Lagarde, you discover that she's quite harsh as regards the presence of women or the absence of women in the field of finance. She described the world. She described one day. It was in an interview on a French TV channel. She described the world of global finance as populated by male clones. She uses the word clones. So quite strong, especially in trading rooms. This is a risk factor. So it's interesting because she framed it in a managerial and neoliberal framework. Of course, that's a risk factor. As it is whenever an identical fraction of the population completely dominates a field. Interesting, because if you enlarge that to ethnicity, to social class, it opens a lot of possibilities for many things. Women, it seems to me, she says, are more attentive to risk. They do not manage their asset portfolios in the same way as their male counterparts. Unfortunately, finance remains a very male-dominated environment. 2% of bank presidents worldwide are women, and only 20% of senior executives. We'll see that the world of central banks is a bit ahead of that. That is, it's probably, I risk this hypothesis, an avant-garde in the process of feminization, which may appear a bit surprising because we usually see central banks as very conservative institutions. I will argue a bit the contrary. That is probably the place where things in the field of finance in general, of course, are moving faster. Of course, there are well-known cases to our current presidents or governors. I will use the word governor. Don't be surprised. It's not the governor in the sense of a territorial governor, regional governor here. It's in the sense of a gouverneur. It's a French word at the origin that was particularly used for the Banque de France, for the central bank. And governors as diffused as an expression to designate the number one, the president, the chairman of that will be the focus of this presentation, the major focus of this presentation. So, of course, heard of Janet Yellen in the US, the Fed, mandate between 2014 and 2018, but you also have here Christine Lagarde, French president of the ECB, European Central Bank, and you have also the example of Elvira Nabiulina, who is in charge since 2013, showing a long-standing position, dominant position, where in Russia, in the Russian Central Bank, the Central Bank of Russia, she's very important today in the field of economic policy in Russia. So these are probably the most economically, monetary, it's clear, but economically even larger, most powerful women in the world. Janet Yellen is not in charge anymore as regards ECB. She was also Secretary of the Treasury, as you know, which appears to be the case for some of the women governing the central banks. Why do we focus on top one leaders? That can be, of course, debated, and more largely to members of monetary councils. You will see that I will enlarge a bit. For me, obvious intellectual, scientific reasons. First, because they concentrate a very concrete power of decision. Members of monetary policy committees have the right, it's a right that is given to them to decide over short-term interest rates that are fixed by the central bank. It's a very powerful tool that they have in their hands. They are the only ones to have the possibility to vote, to decide, to produce a decision which has a very strong impact on the financial markets, obviously, but also on the economy. And very often we see that today with Donald Trump on the political sphere. they are at the center of the political debate. They also, and that's very important, concentrate a very, very high symbolic capital. It's something that I guessed in the 90s that they would be central in the modern capitalist system, very financialized, where monetary policy is very important, but a bit badly understood. And everything that happened since I began this research was the confirmation of that. Of course, the biggest confirmation was the financial crisis of 2008-2009, where Bernanke and all the central bankers in Europe, it was Jean-Claude Trichet at that time, intervened strongly on the market and in a sense saved the financial system, saved the planet. And they went on doing that in the following years with quantitative easing, with certain tools that are very central today in the management of finance. Before that, I had been sort of concrete proof of the very, very high symbolic capital of those persons with the figure of Alan Greenspan. Maybe you remember of him. It's probably the second person in the world history for which a book has been titled The Quotations of Chairman something. There were the quotations of Chairman Mao, and there were the quotations of Chairman Greenspan, published in the US. It's true, I don't invent, so very high symbolic capital. But they also have, more precisely, a symbolic power, which is very strong. That is power through discourse. A sentence by a central banker, especially by the president, the governor, has strong effects. Direct effect, measured effect by econometricians on the financial markets, and political and economic effects, obviously. There are also, and that's of course obviously very important as regard the gender issue, there are models of behavior. There are models of which may inspire, especially young women, in the case of the feminization, showing them that it's possible to become the president of the most powerful institutions in the world economic system today. And I think this is very important to focus on the most prominent, let's say like this, characters, figures in the process. And finally, for me, since the very beginning, I had sort of personal question on how does a society select the persons who are in charge with the money, with not only the currency, it's not only about exchange rate, it's about the value of the money, which is something very strong. I mean, we all depend on the value of money, and we all know that, especially when we travel. But in general, with all the debates on inflation, the rising prices, etc., it's obviously a central social function in our societies. And my very sociological question was, with sufficiently knowledgeable, not expert, excellent, or I would say capable in various aspects, including moral dimensions, to be in charge of money. I will not comment very long on the theoretical perspective, which of course you know. We had to, of course, the sociology of habitus and the sociology of fields, gender dimension, which is present in Bourdieu's work, of course, in masculine domination, but which has developed in the economic sphere with works such as the book by Céline Bessières and Sybille Golac recently about inequality relating to gender, which are intertwined in a complex way with processes of domination in the economic sphere. And we think that it's, of course, very important. We also refer to economics, and it's quite interesting to see that economists are not so far from us in terms of what they investigate when dealing with issues. What are the determinants of monetary policy, for example? They are interested in individual characteristics, for example. We discovered that. Of course, a way which is not exactly the way sociologists deal with these issues. And of course, we try to develop a more global, historical, and economic perspective on the topic. As regards the methods, as you will see, we don't do a lot of interviews. It's very difficult. We have learned through experience that it's very, very difficult. We have had occasions to discuss with central bankers at the occasion of presentation. So it's often informal discussions with them, because Our work is as interested in some central banks, not only in Europe, in Tunisia and various places. And we have had the occasions to have discussions with central bankers, but it's very difficult to get information through formal interviews, the usual way we do. So what do? We collect biographical information. It's really our strategy. Biographical in a large sense, that is not only the social demographics, the classical variables relating to education, professional trajectory, which are obviously central in our work, but also elements of discourse, interviews, and there are a lot. There are persons that more and more, and especially since sort of revolution of communication in the central banks during the years 2000, communication about central bankers themselves is part of the game now. Interviews, which may be in some cases very personal, like in the case of Christine Lagarde, for example. So now, after this very general, broad picture of the research and the settings of the research, a few elements about the questions. What are our questions in this research? There are a lot, and I will try to answer at least some of them. Of course, in this presentation, I cannot answer all the questions. The glass ceiling is the first question. Is there a specific glass ceiling in the world of central banks? And when did it break? How did it break? Does it exist a particular way to break the glass ceiling in the field of central banks? Are there particular trajectories which allow women to access top positions in the field of central banks? So it was very much about this issue. How is it that finally it happens, but how is it? What are the mechanisms? What is the process? Not so obvious. I mean, it's something quite complex to explain. So of course, we had in mind that they probably had specific sorts of capitals outside the fact that there are women at a certain period where equality becomes a norm, which is obviously the general trend which leads them to dominant positions. There was in the literature a debate about women being more conservative than men and relating their nomination, their appointment as leader of the central bank to this risk aversion that is evoked by Christine Lagarde in the citation that I commented. Are they more risk averted? And is it a reason why at a certain moment, because a sort of official norm in the field of central bank is to appoint a central banker that is more conservative as regard inflation, as regard the price, especially as regard money issues, as the president or as a member of the Monetary Council, and is it something that relates to a specific characteristic of women? Of course, you will see it's very difficult to answer this kind of issue with the data that we have till now. For first, a reason that I can already give to you, which is they are so rare. I mean, to do statistics with so few women, it's very difficult. So the conclusions may be a bit delicate. Is that important? That's an issue that we had in mind, especially with the article in Le Monde Diplomatique, because we published in a journal that is committed in the public debate. And one of the questions is, does it matter? There are women, but if they decide exactly the same as men, maybe it's not that important. And I'll maintain a sort of openness with this question because it's not an easy issue. And the conclusion of the article of Le Monde Diplomatique, if you read it, is that it's still an interrogation. There is still an interrogation with that. We think with IKIS that it's very important, but it's until now quite difficult to give arguments which are specifically related to monetary policy. There are a lot of other arguments, of course, especially arguments related to the norm of equality, which is sufficient, self-sufficient, I think. But with some men, sometimes, and we saw that in discussions with central bankers, you have to argue that it matters for monetary policy or economic policy, including very progressive economists or central bankers. And finally, is it something important for the future of central banks? Will it change the way the economy is governed? Will it change the way monetary policy will be produced? Will it, for example, have consequences in terms of social inclusion, an interest for reducing inequality, an interest for environmental issues, and so on? Very large and difficult questions, but we guess they are very important questions, and that are questions that are also transferable to other spheres of public policy in general and economic policy in particular. Of course, especially as a part of budget policy, of economic policy, which is budget policy, budgetary policy. Of course, there is monetary policy and budgetary. As regards short-term policy, these are the two big, parts of economic policy. Okay, maybe I'll skip, not completely, but I evoke that quite rapidly, insisting with a bit redundant with what precedes. There is an important idea here. It's the idea that the field that we study is not completely autonomous. It's a field that is very particular. I think it's the second point here. It's a field that in English we can call intersectional, in Portuguese interdimensional, which means that it's an intersection of other fields, and especially three big fields. And you will see that it has a lot of consequences in terms of where do women come from, etc. It will be important for what will follow. What are these fields? There is obviously the political and administrative field, including the central bank, which is part of a system of public action, which is in quasi totality of the cases a public institution. I mean, at least in majority public, but in most of the cases 100% public. So it's clearly connected to the political sphere. The appointment is made by head of state, prime ministers or presidents, depending on the institutional settings, but it's clearly very strongly connected to the political field, but also to the administration in general. There are, of course, a lot of connections with statistical administrations, with the treasury, etc., etc. That's obvious. But there is also a very important link, which I noticed since the 90s. That's why I was very interested in the topic. It's the connection with the academic field, the scientific field. And that refers to the issue of scientization. More and more, academics are present in the government of central banks, are appointed after careers in the academy, after having published books, articles, constructed symbolic capital in the academic sphere. We can just take the example of Bernanke, who was an academic specialist of the crisis of the 30s and was appointed as the president of the Fed, the chairman of the Fed, and he had to deal with a new crisis, which he analyzed, of course, referring to his own work on the crisis of the 30s, of the Great Depression. So the field of economics is really very important. And you will see in the case of women, it raises some important or interesting issues. And finally, obviously, there is the field of finance and more largely the economic field. It's clear that actions in a central bank are financial first, monetary and financial, let's say, but they deal with the financial markets every day. They communicate in direct connection with the financial market. They regulate the banks and they are at the top of the system of banks. So they are a central financial institution. So three fields that interconnect in a very particular, bizarre place, not that well known, not that well understood, especially by the laymen who usually don't really get what exactly is a central bank. It's a bank, but not exactly a bank like others. It's the bank of the banks. It has very particular functions, which is at the intersection of very, very powerful fields. So we are interested in a field of power, which is technically very precisely institutionally framed and defined, where the decisions are very strictly regulated. The power of decision, in a sense, is limited, but where very important communicative power exists. They produce reactions through words, through their use of language. And in this particular field, of course, there is a relation, as in any field, in Bourdieu theory, between positions, dispositions, and position takings. And so our major hypothesis in a lot of the studies that we produce on the data is to try to relate positions in the field, trajectories, and the type of position taking. So here the issue is obvious. Is there a relation between the fact that the governor or the president is a woman and her position taking in monetary issues or in other issues relating to central banks. Finally, it of course raises the issue of what type of capital do they mobilize, and it's clear that it's a mixture of symbolic capital is of course absolutely central. When you have to deal with money, you need to be perceived as someone able to do it and able to do it a moral, political, efficient, etc. way. Symbolic capital is very important, but capitals that relate to experiences in finance obviously are important. Political capital and social capital are also obviously very important. And finally, scientific capital appears now to be very, very important. If you want to argue in certain spheres, you need to have at least a certain level of academic or scientific, if you prefer, capital in order to be able to argue. So composite capital, field that is intersectional, obviously leads to capitals that are a bit diverse and complex. And finally, as you will see, there is no one way to get to a top position. It's funny because, for example, one day I met an academic economist, and he told me in all the world now, all governors of central banks, all central bankers at the level of monetary councils, they are academics. So, no, you should not say that. You want that. It's your desire. You'd like that. Because he was reacting to the appointment of a French governor, the current governor, François Villeroy de Galhau, was not an academic precisely, but as you will see, and we argue that very thoroughly in our paper on scientization, it's not the case in many countries that central bankers come from there is not one single simple way to become a central banker, and it's much more complex than that. In some countries, religion may matter, for example. Okay, let's move now finally to first part, the history. I'll go a bit quicker. I don't know how much I have. 45? 45 minutes? 45 is okay? So I'll go a bit quicker now. It's a funny story. We thought it was funny, so we reproduced it in the paper at Le Monde Diplomatique. And this is the fact that an Austrian journal said we have had the first one. We are the ones, the Austrians. And so we checked, and we didn't find, it's not written, this history has not been written. 40 years before Maria Schlaumeier, so 40 years before the first ones to be the head of the central bank in Austria, which is supposed to be the first case, there was Greta Kukov, German Democratic Republic, in the DDR, in the GDR. Greta Kukov, very particular profile. She was a socialist, anti-Nazi. It's better? An anti-Nazi resistant. Okay. Sorry. She was an anti-Nazi resistant. She was put into jail by the Nazis. She was even sentenced to death. Her husband died by the Nazis and so on. And in 50, so very early, she became the president of the German Democratic Republic Central Bank. Of course, it's not a central bank in the capitalist current sense, but she was governing money. I mean, in terms of power, she even in a sense had more power, direct, concrete, technical power than many central bankers today. Of course, in relation with the political power, this central bank was not at all independent. It was very different. And we discovered that she's not the only one. There is a second one in 55 in Bulgaria, also in the Soviet system, I would say, in general, of countries in the Soviet world. And then again, a woman from the GDR. So funnily, the podium is completely Eastern European countries of the East, so very similar, that's what we write in the paper in Le Monde Diplomatique, to a podium in athletics or swimming at the Olympics in the 80s, you know, where the GDR dominated, because the women were very strong in sport in these countries too. There is sort of a parallel. But they lead by far, in historical terms, the conquest of power. And it has been completely forgotten. Completely deleted, in a sense, deleted by history, deleted by the fact that the GDR doesn't exist anymore. It's a country that doesn't exist anymore. So the memory of the GDR is very problematic in Germany and in Europe in general. So they don't exist anymore, but they were there and they had power. And funnily, after them, Bolivia comes with an acting governor, Tamara Sanchez Peña, only a few months, but she acted as the governor. So Bolivia came before the European countries. And then Chen Muhua in the popular Republic of China. So People's Republic of China. So China came before European countries. So the first countries, there is even a Laotian in the sixth position, are not at all European countries. Clearly not. I mean, they are Eastern European countries, not Western European countries. And after that, it diffused largely in various countries. I will comment on that, with, of course, a strong position in former Eastern Bloc. It's clear that the Eastern Bloc has played a particular role as regards the feminization of leading positions in the sphere of money, or monetary issues and policies, if you want. In the United States, it's only 2014, so it's quite late, even later for the ECB. And the Europeans are really not dominating, I mean, the Western Europeans especially, even if Schaumeyer was, of course, appointed in the beginning of the 90s, so not long after Chen Muhua, the Laotian, and so on. So, according to the statistics, I say here that in 2024, there were 14 central banks led by women, showing how low it is. I mean, it's after an increase, after a rather important increase, we see it's still around 10%. The OMFIF, which is an organization, women organization that follows the issue, says they are now 15% in 2050. We don't have the same data. It's lower than that. It's closer to 10% in 25. The reason is they include the governors or the presidents of the regional central banks in the US, which doesn't make sense. If you compare national situations or central banks, you should compare states, at least nation states. That's a matter of discussion, but anyway, well, that's the picture. Unfortunately, I think you don't manage to see the countries, but you see the evolution here from East Germany to Vietnam in the recent period, and we are actualizing this picture now. Why did they manage to get to that position in the Eastern Bloc? What are their characteristics? When we look carefully at their trajectories, we see many things. They were intellectuals, doctors. They were among the first women to get a PhD. Often internationalized, very internationalized. Of course, the political context of crisis, of rupture, of historical rupture in the processes of domination are very important, and we think it works until today. And there are also studies showing that women tend to be more appointed during crisis, economic but also political crisis, than men, which is interesting. So the context, especially the context of crisis, are important. What I'm very focused at the moment on linguistic issues. They have a lot of linguistic capital. They have an experience abroad. They speak many languages. Interestingly, the first one had been to the US. So even if it was a Soviet bloc, I mean, the trajectory is related to a global world. The third one, Witkowski, who was also a German Jewish communist, had a PhD in Basel, in Switzerland. So very internationalized. They were very internationalized. Of course, political commitment was very important in this first sequence. The pioneers, they were very strongly politically oriented. The case of Chen Muhua, if you want, we can discuss that later, is very interesting because she was part of the right wing of the Chinese Communist Party, not the strictly Maoist. And so during the Cultural Revolution, She was, of course, put completely aside, but she came back with the Deng Xiaoping group, and she was she had been attacked because she was linked to she was a foreigner, more or less, because she spoke other languages and so on. She was not a real Chinese during the Cultural Revolution. Anyway, what is interesting is also the fact that they have often a political and intellectual capital which is inherited. The fathers, but also the brothers, in the case of the Bulgarian central banker, are very important. Okay, now I move to the general dynamics after this period of the pioneers, which is of course very important, on which we can come back in the discussion. So we use here a very large database. We'll use biographical data. I will not comment too long. It's classical prosopographical work. And we show a progression which is quite slow. Appointments of women are still very rare. I will come back on the case of Europe a bit later. It's a general progress, but still very slow and unequal. Very diverse in terms of regions. What are their characteristics? Are they specific? Now, the ones that have been appointed after the pioneers, including not including the pioneers because we are after 2000, so we don't include the pioneers anymore. We focus on the more recent period. During this more recent period, there is a characteristic that disappears, that is the link to the political field. They are not anymore related to the political field more than men. It's the contrary. They are not more often coming from financial private institutions, including banks, less than men. Interestingly, they are less often coming from the private sector, less from public administration in general, less from the university. So what is their specificity? They are less all that. They come more often from the central bank itself, showing that the process is first and foremost a process that occurs inside the realm, the world of central banks, with an ally to the central banks, which is an obvious ally, if you know a bit the field of monetary policy and monetary institutions. But in Brazil, you're used to these debates and these issues. It's the IMF, it's the World Bank, it's the international organization, where some of these women have gone as well, more than men. They are more often internationalized in this sense. Again, we find the value of international capital, which relates to linguistic capital. That's their characteristics. They're not very different from male, not that different, but a bit. And the differences are strongly related to more than education, to the type of trajectory they have had. They have gone through a PhD, not less than men. They are very well trained. It's very high in this sphere. It's around half of the leaders of central banks who have a PhD, so it's a very educated group. And but they didn't enter they entered less the university and more through the central bank itself. They are what we call insiders. They have a profile of insiders. Okay, I don't comment. It's the same results more or less that are developed. When you look at their main career, because in our data we have noticed that careers trajectories are, of course, in various sectors. You change, of course. You don't necessarily do all your career in the academy, all your career as high civil servant in the state. It's often the case. It's often the case that people have only one sector in their career, but there are some movements, some changes. Boltanski would have said multi-positionality, in French multi-positionality, but in the course of the career. During the trajectory, you change the sector and so on. But women are clearly more often characterized by the career which is centered in the institution of the central bank itself. So the weight of insiders is the double, a bit less than the double, but almost the double compared to male. So it's a very strong effect here. In terms of the dominance of their career, it's clear that the system in which they have managed to progress is much more often, progress until they become the number one, is more often the central bank itself. For us, it's an interesting and important result already. We have also other, so they are more diverse in a sense. They are less, they correspond less to the standard patterns of careers that the men follow. These are the comments. One of the comments being the surprise not to find another representation of academic trajectories, because we had this idea, naive at the origin, that the change would occur through the academy because of the elevation of the academic level and the fact that more and more women become academics, become professors, including in economics. It's not the case. One of the reasons being that economics remain one of the most masculine, including in terms of ambience, in terms of the environment in which the women work, an environment which has often been described as toxic. There are now a lot of studies insisting, especially the very famous study by Alice Wu. She studied tweets by male PhD students about male and female economists, and they were highly sexist. You know, there is a very strong particularity of a discipline that is highly competitive, and where the dominant values were still, because it's now changing a bit, but very masculine. And it's documented now. There is work. So a fine sociology of the academy shows that the disciplines are, of course, very different in this perspective. What surprised me the most was the fact that the political field was not so important. But of course, they are appointed by politicians, so there is a link with there is always a link with the political field. But they were not hired, they were not appointed because they had direct, explicit political capital and experience in the political field. As what do we intend? What do we mean by that? To be a politician, to be a leader of a party, or to be elected as an MP or any function of that kind. And finally, the importance of international organizations. This is just to show, and that's what we develop in the article about scientization, that the patterns is also complex in terms of regions of the world. It's clear that there is no clear domination of developed countries as regards the number of women appointed. It's much more complex than that. It varies according to the period. Recently, it has a bit declined in the global south. I mean, recently on this picture, but it was not the case around 2000. So it's clearly things that are changing. Our guess is that there is a Me Too effect that is very strong in Western developed capitalist countries now. And so the norm is the pressure is so strong, including in Europe, that it has created this discrepancy, which is relatively recent. Finally, typology and actualization of the data, and some elements to characterize case studies, which I will not present in depth. I don't have the time. I have still 6 or 7 minutes. We did a cluster analysis. We did a MCA, of course, but I will not present the MCA. I don't have the time, but we do a cluster analysis. I will present a solution of the presentation, which is in 3 clusters, but I could have been more. That could have been more refined. In the publication, we will refine this presentation, of course. And the 3 groups are interesting because there is a large group, half of the women who are insiders. We already had this data, so it's clearly the majority dominant group. And there are 2 subgroups that are a bit more complex. One with a combination of academic and international institution careers, which is not so important. And we have another quite interesting group, around 25% as well, which is composed with, when I say it's composed, it's another representation. It's not completely homogeneous, of course, but you know, cluster analysis, it's not something that gives you things that are sort of static essences, no. And these are civil servants, national civil servants with a lower level of education. So it's a small group that exists where these women, they only have a master's degree, and they have entered the administration. So it's a dominated group, around 20%. What happened since 2020? 15 new governors or presidents, I list here the countries and I qualify where they come from, and most of them are insiders. What is fascinating is, again, as sort of past dependency, an overrepresentation of countries from the Eastern Bloc, ex-Yugoslavia, ex-USSR, Cambodia, Vietnam. Vietnam is still a communist country, but all the continents are represented. And interestingly, often you have small countries, but you have, what is striking here in this list is you have Rwanda, you have Syria. Syria just had a woman in 2024 after very huge political cataclysms, political crisis. It appears that sometimes a woman is appointed as the head of the central bank. Tunisia is a very interesting case. They never had a governor, as a woman governor, but they have had since 2018 a vice-governor, Nadia Gama, which is interesting. In the Muslim world, it's quite rare to see that, even if there are at least 6 or 7 women who were appointed as head of central banks in the Muslim world. So it's not so few. We cite the countries in the paper of Le Monde Diplomatique. But what is fascinating is that since 2014, there is a complete parity inside their governing council, which is strange. Why Tunisia? There is the heritage of Bourguiba, and there is a phenomenon that I discovered there that we describe in the paper, which is the fact that the higher education in economics is highly feminized now. That is, the proportion of women is very high in master's level and even in the level of doctorate. It's probably a country which is at the avant-garde of the feminization of higher education in economics. And the consequence of that is that when they hire a central banker inside the central bank in Tunisia, they have 10 competitors, there are 10 candidates, and among the 10 candidates, there are 9 women. So they tend to hire more and more women. That's the way they describe it. So it's not an affirmative action policy that led to this. There is one because the parity has been inscribed in the constitution. So the parity it's clearly affirmative action. So it's a combination of affirmative action in the council and a mechanism that, as a consequence, leads more and more women to the top. And I can tell you, we had a conference there, and there were a lot of very women executives from economics and management departments, very high level, who were very positive about the way they could manage their career and they could change the reality. Interestingly, when there was a debate on monetary policy, the women didn't speak so much. It was more the men, actually. So showing that can hide the inequality behind. I mean, formal parity being something that they show like this. We have the parity. We are very proud of that. They were all very proud of that when they spoke to me and to us. But concretely, behind the scene, especially inside the council, and we don't have the minute of the council of the Central Bank of Tunisia, we don't really know what happens. That would be interesting, of course. Brazil is quite timid as regards, there is a deputy governor who's a woman, Isabela Moreira Correa. Today, there were some years ago, but it's still a council, which is very masculine. I think it's 8 or 9, comparable to the situation in Europe. And I unfortunately don't have the time to present the last part, but I knew that because it's a bit too long, which is about the ECB. But I just tell you what is the objective of this study. We have only 7 women on 85 in the governing council of the ECB since it was created, 1999. And we have done with Brigitte Leroux, who happens to be a pioneer, a woman pioneer. She's a mathematician, and she was having her thesis in the 70s. And they are very rare, I can tell you, in applied mathematics. And we did this study. Are they specific? And do we have tools in order to infer from our data, which are on very, very low frequencies, that there is an effect? And for that, Brigitte has developed methods called combinatorial inference in geometric data analysis. So we have tools that allow us to go further through the conclusions in statistical terms. And I just rapidly comment the result. They are very specific. You see here, they are the ones that are in the ellipses. They are very specific on a second axis, and the second axis in Europe, interestingly, again, relates to politics and relates to the European level, that is to the federal level in Europe. It means that they are appointed in the council, but not by member states. They are appointed by all the member states together, that is the European Council, the European Council, and they are appointed in the executive board. It means that they will work in Frankfurt, they will exercise at the federal level. Meaning that in the particular situation of Europe, the member states, they don't hire women at the top of their own national central bank. Example, France, until now, never any woman at the top. But they accept to hire in the executive board of the ECB. And they, of course, accepted the appointment of a woman as the president in 2019, which was a big rupture. A big rupture, a double rupture, because she's not an economist, Christine Lagarde. She's also a jurist. She's not even an economist, so showing that was a very, very disruptive decision. But before that, she had been, as you know, general secretary of the general director of the IMF. So she had a particular international capital and credential. So we were happy because we could conclude with statistical inference that there is an effect that women are particular in terms of the way they are appointed, in terms of types of career. They are more international as well. And that's the pole of international trajectories as well. And here, in the particular context of Europe, the political field plays a role of equilibration, or you could say, rebalancing in favor of women. And the reason, I can describe that if you want in the discussion, but is the fact that the European Parliament has erupted in 2015, saying it's impossible that we have a council that is purely masculine. It's just not possible today. So things are very slowly changing with a lot of resistance. And when they are changing, it means that in Europe until now, at the ECB, they are changing through the highest level. Now, there was the issue, and I finish with that. Are they specific in terms of position takings? No, they are not very specific. It's impossible to conclude. There are too few, and they are difficult to characterize in terms of dovishness or hawkishness. I don't want to explain that now, but more or less conservative in terms of interest rates or the reverse. They are more conservative, it's clear, but there are so few. One of the reasons being that they are more often from the German bloc inside the governing council of the ECB. And the German historical traditional position are more conservative than the ones of the French as regards monetary issues. So it's impossible to conclude that there is an effect relating to the fact that they are women. They are clearly selected a certain way, and it appears that they are, in Europe at least, they seem to be a bit more conservative in monetary issues. To finish, but clearly it's not the case of Christine Lagarde, the president, and it's not, of course, nothing. She's probably at the heart of a process of change, which has, for example, led to the inclusion of environmental issues, social inclusion issues at a larger extent, at least in the discourse of the central bank. That is, the discourse is very progressive. The reality of the decisions is very difficult to say if they have very strong equalitarian effects. I can even say that no, in general, monetary policy hasn't changed a lot since Christine Lagarde is the president. She's probably more dovish than Jean-Claude Trichet. So if you compare to the previous French that was leading the ECB, she's clearly a bit more dovish, but our women counterparts in the ECB governing council were not. So it's very, very difficult to conclude. And if you read the article in Le Monde Diplomatique, you will see that we conclude by, will it change the world? We don't know, actually. Difficult to say. And when I asked colleagues and friends and so on, it's very diverse. Some say, no, will not change, because the process of selection of a woman at the top of a central bank is such that they are more conservative. They have characteristics that finally do not really affect strongly the kind of monetary policy that they will lead. anyway, if it changes the way human relations are held inside the management of the ECB, for example, it's very important. And I can say it's the case. Jean-Claude Trichet, Christine Lagarde, is not the same. The reactions by the unions and so on are very different. So it may have some effects, but internal effects. In terms of positive discrimination, positive affirmative action for women, it's clearly the avant-garde. The avant-garde is, of course, the women themselves. They are the ones that, and we see that also at the European Commission with von der Leyen, who is not progressive at all. She's very, very conservative. But in terms of gender rebalancing, they play a positive role. That's it. And there is the issue of the academia, which is now changing. So probably one of the major places of change will be the academia in the future, because struggles now take place in the universities, in the departments, including issues relating to sexual violence and so on, which were, of course, invisible and which are, after Me Too, in some places, which have become very important and very central. So it's a symbolic revolution. As any symbolic revolution, it creates backlashes, very strong backlashes. There are a lot of struggles behind the scene, you know, in the corridor struggles, lutte de couloir, palace wars, as Dezalé and Garth said. Palace wars are very important. That's the place where things will change. I stop here. Thank you very much. And sorry for the mic. I don't use the mic very well, so it was probably very annoying for you, but I'm sorry. Eu entendo português. Se não entendo,
eu tento explicar. Gente, nós temos um tempo aí razoável até para as questões. Alguém gostaria de começar? C'est un peu intimidant.
That can be on any part of the presentation, including, I mean, the research, the way we work. You can ask whatever you want. Not necessarily.
Eu tinha uma dúvida que acho que você falou, mas não ficou muito claro para mim. Tem que falar inglês? Pode falar? Não, que eu não sei falar inglês. Ah, tá. Então, então. Sobre essa questão de que a conclusão final é que as mulheres têm que ser mais conservadoras e ortodoxas para estar nos bancos e essas coisas? Essa era a minha dúvida.
Est-ce qu'elles sont Yes. See, yes, I think I can answer that. Probably there is very much related to the way they are selected, the way they are appointed. So the selection process is really central. And I will exemplify with the case of Europe. There is a bargaining, it's clear, before the appointment at the level of states, at the level of presidents and prime ministers. And clearly, one of the debates is, of course, that may be a woman that we appoint, but in this case, and the French, they were at some moment quite in favor of that, but that's clearly not the only criteria, of course. All the criteria that relate to the characteristics, they are preferably economists, they are preferably already qualified, they must have some experience and so on. But what is more important is the fact that will they follow clearly the institutional requisites of the ECB, and that's very strong from the German side. They are really very strongly attached to the constitution. It's really a second habit, a second body. They're completely embodied. I mean, they really refer very strongly to the respect of the rule. So that will be a bargain. And that's one of the reasons why I think, to explain why 2 of the 7 women were lawyers, actually. So one of the solutions was, well, we will appoint lawyers. One of them in the executive board was devoted to legal issues of regulation, the banking system. After 2010, it became very, very important. After the crisis first, after 2008, but especially during the crisis of the euro, it became very obvious that legal issues would be also central. And as the proportion of women qualifying in the discipline is higher, that has been a way. But there is also a counterpart which relates to the general mood as regard monetary policy. And they cannot be very heterodox. There is no heterodox. The governing council of the ECB, that's just impossible to imagine right now, except maybe in one country, Cyprus, but for the executive board itself, it's really very difficult. And my guess, but I don't have the proof. It's very difficult to prove that because we don't have the archives, we don't have yet the testimonies by actors and so on, which I'm very eager to read testimonies, but until now they don't speak, is that there is a bargain as regards the level of orthodoxy. Yeah, and so, okay, yeah, we take this woman, but we must be sure that she will not deviate too much. And Christine Lagarde, she gave some, well, she had been the head of the IMF, so it was already, okay, she was in the general line of orthodox monetary and financial policies in the world. She was close to Sarkozy, so right-wing, which is important. She had a political trajectory, which showed that she would not be too radical in terms of monetary policy. And she was in the line of Draghi. Mario Draghi was, typically the center left, if you use that kind of category, inside the committee. But it's clear that you should not conclude that they are conservative because they are women. Some economists do that, and I think it's mad. They do regression, and they say, other things being equal, the fact that they are women makes them more conservative. No, it's not that. It's the selection process. And of course, we hire more conservative women. It was the case in the UK when the Conservative Party appointed Margaret Thatcher as a candidate. Margaret Thatcher was ultra-conservative. She was a conservative revolutionary. So this issue of conservatism or orthodoxy is quite complex, and I think must be analyzed in terms of social selection, bargain. Bargain is very important, and behind the scene. There are a lot of bargains in Europe all the time between member states, between various interests, political parties, and so on. Today, it's a mess, but they are not very visible. They are not very public. And another problem that we have is the fact that, except Christine Lagarde, who gave a very interesting interview, which I mentioned, speaking about herself in personal terms, they usually don't speak about their experience. They don't want. They don't say anything. I guess that it's the same in Brazil. They are not that talkative about their experience as central bankers. In the US, Bernanke writes a big book after his experience during the crisis. So you have different attitudes toward experience of being a central banker. And so it's very, in a sense, very difficult to really know. We have another difficulty in Europe to finish, and I didn't mention it, but in the analysis, it has created it creates a lot of difficulties. It's the fact that, contrary to what happens in the Fed, the Federal Open Market Committee, the minutes, they are they are anonymous. So you don't have the names of the persons that speak out during a meeting. Which means that if there are 7 opponents to Mario Draghi or to Christine Lagarde, and it happened actually many times that there were opponents, you don't know who they are. You have to guess. It is the German, it is this one, because they have already spoken out in the press. But in many cases, you have to guess. That's why it's a sort of industry. Central bank watching is an industry in banks or in financial institutions to analyze individually how people behave. They do a sort of wild sociology, actually, wild prosopography. They do that just because it's very important for the markets. If you know that the one that has been appointed will argue very strongly in favor of a rise of the interest rate, it has a lot of consequences for any bank, for any fund, for everybody, in a sense. The central bank is really a very powerful institution. So that's why there is a social focus on those persons. And the issue of women is really, we have really an experience of that attracts the attention. There are reactions, there are men that say, no, it doesn't matter, it's not so important, it's excellence and qualification that matters, and all these debates are concentrated in a sense. In high power places like that, it's a sort of concentrate, as we say for alimentary issues, a concentrate of big issues. Sorry, I was very long for the answer.
Inglês, English or Portuguese?
Bom, primeiro, muito obrigado, Frédéric, Lidiane, por moderar e Frédéric pela apresentação. Duas perguntas. A primeira, você começa a apresentação falando da forma como as mulheres são recrutadas e que elas são pouco recrutadas do campo acadêmico, do campo político, que te surpreende, mas são recrutadas a partir internamente, né, dos próprios bancos centrais. Eu queria saber se você observou diferenças em relação a isso entre países. Se isso é algo geral ou isso é mais característico de um país ou de outro país. A segunda pergunta é relacionado a quando essas mulheres, não sei se você tem essa resposta, tá? Mas se você pode, se você pensou, observou algo sobre isso. Quando essas mulheres estão nessas posições de governors, você diz, bom, elas podem, mas talvez não seja, não posso garantir, não tenho tantos dados para isso, serem mais conservadoras, mas em algumas pautas não tanto, como na ambiental. Mas eu queria saber se elas adotam, se elas estão na vanguarda para adotar políticas de inclusão das próprias mulheres. Se elas fazem parte de... Essa vanguarda delas se relacionam também a assumir uma pauta feminista do ponto de vista mesmo de gerenciamento. Ok?
Yes, I understood perfectly. Yes. As regards the country differentiations in the internal recruitment, we have data, of course, and have them in mind to some extent. It's quite similar globally. There is an overrepresentation of insiders everywhere, so it's a general pattern. But this pattern is clearly stronger in specific regions. If I remember well, in Latin America, Asia. In Europe, except the ECB, because the case of the ECB is a case of where we see that political careers are also very important. So it's quite atypical from this point of view. There is another region which is quite atypical in general as regards the training of central bankers. It's the Middle East, especially the oil countries, you know, the Qatar, etc., Saudi Arabia, etc., the Gulf countries. And in the Gulf countries, we observe that they are less often economists. They are more often master's degree. They have a master's degree, and in management, business, MBAs, and things like that. Very internationalized, of course, very Anglo-Saxon. They have moved to the US often. And here, they are overrepresented, if I remember well, in the third class, the third cluster, in the Middle East. I don't have other elements. I will look at the data, maybe not tonight, but and I'll tell you. I guess that there is no strong variation, This small variation in the ECB, which I mentioned, politicization stronger in a sense, which relates to the history of the ECB as a new central bank and many other aspects. Political capital, legal capital are very, very important, overrepresented, including for women. So it's a general specificity of Europe in this sense, and the Middle East. We notice that there is something in the Middle East that makes central bankers at this level, that is presidents, governors, but it's also the case for we guess, because we have already looked at data for deputy governors, vice governors. But elsewhere, no, it's quite general, insiders, and there are probably regions, I don't remember which ones, but where it's even stronger, where you have really a very high proportion of insiders. I don't remember if it's Oceania. I think New Zealand, Australia could be in this situation, if I remember well. New Zealand is a particular case because they were the central bank which led in the 80s the revolution, the sort of managerial and communication revolution of the central banks. They began to have another communication policy, setting particular objectives, etc. They renewed the way to behave as a central banker. So New Zealand is an interesting case. Second question. Yes, and I'm sorry because I didn't show that enough, but it's clear that Christine Lagarde, for example, is known for having put in place gender mainstreaming, which goes in the same direction as gender mainstreaming, as we say, is set at the level of the European Commission. It's a general policy of the European Commission. In Europe, there is a gender mainstreaming, so positions. It's the case in national administrations. In France, there is a law about professional equality, which is quite compelling, which is quite interesting in terms of affirmative action. And it's clear that my hypothesis, I don't have all the proofs for that, but that there are groups of women. They are part of all those clubs that have emerged since now 20, 30 years of women executives, including in administrations that function also as a lobby in favor of affirmative action and setting new norms of proportion of managers, of women managers. There is if you want a reference for that, there is a OMFIF. I don't remember what it means exactly. OMFIF, it's an organization. You find their report. Every year they produce a report. And it's clear that women are very much involved in this organization, which argues in favor of the idea that hiring more women will change the way people interact in organizations. It will have consequences as regard human resource management, strong consequences. They are more inclusive. They are more conscious of environmental issues and so on. They have a very progressive discourse. But this discourse, I noticed at many occasions that it's repeated by economists, academic economists, women, in the context of academic debate regarding monetary policy, regarding economic policy, and so on. So it's a particular type of mobilization, I would say, of feminine capitals, which I think is very interesting. But we know that it exists in big companies. There are groups of women that in France, it's very important now. They have played an important role in, for example, the idea that boards should be composed at least by 30% of women. I don't know in Brazil what's the situation as regards these norms, but it's clear that there is a power relation that is going in favor of women in this. But of course, it's still at very low levels. If you look at the central banks, acceding to the top position is still very difficult for women. I mean, we are under 15%. It's still very low. It's comparable to mechanisms of selection in mathematics, the Fields Medal, etc., the Nobel Prizes in physics, the disciplines which are very highly masculine. What makes me just a bit skeptical is the idea that someone like Christine Lagarde, and I'm even more skeptical, I would be even more skeptical with Ursula von der Leyen, will be very conscious of social inequality. The class matters as well, and for them, I'm not so sure. I mean, Christine Lagarde, she's very disruptive when she speaks about economists. They have models, they are cut from reality. She says very interesting things. She's, of course, very aggressive against masculine toxic finance and so on, but she doesn't have a very strong arguments as regard other sources of homogeneity in the central bank. That's the conclusion of our paper. We should discuss diversity at the top of central banks, but it's not only gender diversity. It's also ethnic diversity. If you look at all the members of the governing council of the ECB, it's completely white since the origin. there has been some changes in the US. You have probably seen in the actuality that there is an issue with a black woman inside the Fed, with Trump, was lost first part of the fight. There is also a professional class variation, because the central bank deals with money for everybody. It should be universal. Now there is a big discussion. We have just written a paper about the issue of common good. Central banks are supposed to be also a place of interest for common good. But how do we define common good if we don't integrate the idea of socioeconomic inequality as a center aspect of our common good? Now, if we forget this part, we forget a large part of what creates inequality. So that's the issue now. But I think it's important to support. I mean, that's more a political position, but it's important to support every move towards gender equality, because it creates also dynamics that may have some spillover effects on other elements of dynamics of inequality at a certain moment. I mean, it's sort of bet on the future, but I think we should do that. And clearly, we in our work as sociologists, we have found people really desiring interacting with us, whereas we thought that would be completely disregarded as something coming from sociology, so not very relevant about the real issues of the field. But things are changing. This issue of common good as well, which is held by political economists, by Keynesian economists, and so on, like in Canada and so on, colleagues and friends like that. It begins to change also the mood in social sciences, because showing that economists are maybe not so far from us. I mean, maybe we can also have interactions and have some effects on the general dynamics of social sciences and public policy, because they are directly connected to public policy. So if you want to have an effect, you need to be connected to economists. And Christine Lagarde, in a sense, is an ally, because she's very critical against some aspects of economics.
Boa noite. Eu vi que algumas mulheres que são representantes dos bancos centrais, elas tinham alguma ligação com FMI ou IMF. Lógico que a gente pode fazer várias análises, mas o que o senhor observou de mais relevante nessa relação FMI, IMF e essas mulheres que se tornaram relevantes nos seus campos?
I think I understood your question, which is the specificity of a link between women and the IMF, especially. It's more generally international organizations, which I see as places where the type of capital that women particularly have, that relates to language, the fact to be able to communicate in other languages, to be good in English, and so on. We saw that with Christine Lagarde. I will take the example of Christine Lagarde, which I know a bit better, as she's French, and I read interviews that she gave. She's very prominent. She's a prominent figure. She managed to be the head, the first, to have the leading position at the IMF. There were preconditions for that. She replaced Dominique Strauss-Kahn, you remember, who had a problem related to sexual violence. So there is no chance in this story. She comes here, she arrives as a woman after a guy that is accused of rape, more or less. Remember the issue, the situation, that was that. And she arrives not as an economist. She's not at all an economist, she's a lawyer. She worked in an American firm. She had a very interesting career. She didn't have the highest educational background in France. She went to Sciences Po X, which is not Sciences Po Paris. It's Sciences Po where I used to taught for some years about European issues. You know, it's a very nice institution, selective a bit, but it's not the dominant institution in the field of higher education compared to Sciences Po Paris. It's a provincial Sciences Po, as we say. And then she had a master's degree, vocational in law. And she was very much into private law. And then she moved to a very prominent, one of the biggest American law firm. And she used that because she's also really very at ease in, she's not that bourgeois in terms of social origin. Her mother was a professor of, if I remember well, it's literature, not English, I don't think so. And her father too, was not, if I remember well, even an executive. I have some doubt about it. Anyway, but she was very at ease, and especially in international academic context where she plays the role of the woman that asks questions, that summarizes. She's a politician as well. She has also a political career. She was a Minister of Finance. And so she managed to, as a head of the IMF, she has gone through difficult times, I think, because it was difficult, especially when economists said, well, she's not qualified because she's not an economist. She had that kind of reaction. But as holder of a high political capital, I think she managed to go against that. And I think it's the characteristic of these women. They are very strong in terms of resistance against all sorts of aggression, which are not directly sexist aggressions, but which imply sometimes the idea that they are not completely competent, they are not completely at their place, and so on. So Christine Lagarde is a good example of the fact that these international organizations are seem to be, I don't want to be too strong on that because I'm not totally sure, but less symbolically violent in terms of interpersonal relation than the top economics department, where it's really, well, I happen to be in direct contact with economists who are in the international field, etc. And the idea of ranking is obsessional. I mean, they rank themselves all the time. In an international organization, you're a bit protected against this obsession of academic ranking that our colleague economists, especially the most internationalized one, have. You know, the question they ask all the time, it's, do you have a recent paper in the top 5? I'm very happy because I have a top 5. It's the way they speak. It's all the time ranking themselves and not saying, I have a colleague, he told me, I have a top 5. Okay, but what is it about? I mean, I wanted to know what he... No, it's not the problem. It's quite strange. I mean, the way they have internalized this idea that the world is a world of competition and ranking, and you listen to people according to that has been argued in the press. You listen to people according to their ranking in the REPEC ranking. It has been argued explicitly, right? It has been written by economists in France that you should not listen to someone who is an economist, but who's not in the first 5% of the ranking of the REPEC ranking. Wow. There's an argument of authority based on scientometrics. It's really fascinating. It exists. It's very strong in economics. We can admit that it's quite masculine as an attitude. Just to begin a discussion saying that I'm very proud to have published a top 5, and of course it's also internalized by women in the field. I don't mean that they don't play the game. They play the game, but it's probably something happens there, and probably in international organizations, which are public administrations, a very particular style, but and the central banks are a case of that. In a sense, it's an administration, but very academic at the same time, where you publish, you're a bit protected. And we have examples of women victims of sexism or aggressions or things like that in the university, saying, okay, I go to if not the IMF, to the central bank, my career will be more protected in a sense. Maybe I go too far in this direction, but I think there is something that relates to these two effects. International and political capital is valuable in these institutions compared to the economics department, where you really compete first on publications, and the toxicity of the way economists compete in the scientific field, or the potential toxicity of the way they all the time classify themselves, all the time hierarchize themselves, and so on, we see that in France typically with the very selective scientific class preparatory school, not the university, it's a parallel system of selection, which appears to be rather toxic for even for the best women high school students. Even if they had better marks, better grades than the male, after one semester or one trimester in these institutions, they are under the boys. I mean, it's something very fascinating. The type of competition creates elimination, tendential elimination of women. So what we see in the educational system may exist everywhere. Actually, there's processes of selection that are more or less favorable to dispositions that are tendentially, statistically, probabilistically more masculine or more feminine. I would say that. And again, I think linguistic capital is very important. Educational and linguistic capital, that's the strength of women. And we see that in Tunisia. Tunisia, it's really fascinating. They outperform the boys since high school now. They outperform even at the level of the doctorate in economics. So the problem is that after that, there is a labor market and the rate of employment falls and they are underemployed. So that doesn't solve any solution. But now the inequality is so strong in terms of educational performance in Tunisia. Apparently, it's qualitative work that I did there, but that even the central bank has been obliged to recognize that no, we must hire women. They are better in terms of qualification for the job.
Será que eu poderia fazer duas questões, talvez finais? E se elas não fizerem sentido na pesquisa, mas me chamou a atenção. Primeira pergunta, bem histórica. As pioneiras, elas vêm da Bulgária, em 55.
First, Greta Kukov, GDR.
Em seguida a Alemanha, duas, e da República
Democrática. First GDR, then Bulgaria, then GDR.
Países do antigo bloco soviético. Sim. Então, mesmo que elas tenham um perfil conservador, as pioneiras estavam, digamos, no polo à esquerda da Guerra Fria. Então, essa é a primeira pergunta. Isso essa é uma pergunta mais de história global. Né? E nesse nível da história global, eu acho que eu perdi um pouco a discussão sobre a zona europeia e o problema das identidades nacionais na direção das instituições centrais da economia.
Inside the ECB, you mean? Okay.
E a última pergunta é sobre uma curiosidade a respeito das carreiras, não exatamente profissionais, mas as carreiras sociais dessas mulheres. Quando se discute carreira feminina de sucesso, dirigente, poderosa, etc., tem duas perguntas que se faz muito comumente, eu queria saber se elas apareceram na enquete. Qual é a média de idade com a qual elas se tornam dirigentes, lideranças, etc., né? E se essa carreira ascensional de sucesso, de direção, impacta, você comentou um pouco que elas têm uma origem um pouco de herdeiras, né? A família de origem delas é de herdeiras. Mas e a família de destino, a família que elas constroem, né? Qual que é o padrão de casamento e de maternidade dessas mulheres, né? Está dentro de um padrão de reprodução de elite ou escapa do padrão de reprodução, elas ficam celibatárias, enfim, uma coisa mais ligada à reprodução familiar, propriamente, dessas mulheres.
Thanks for this third question. Unfortunately, I cannot really answer it except age. Age at appointment is similar to the one of men. I don't remember the exact age. It's a bit after 50. There is some variation, especially in the 90s, 2000s. You still had people appointed at a rather young age, like 35 or even sometimes younger. And the women, they are not younger or not older. As far as I remember in our data, there is no strong difference with the men. And unfortunately, we didn't look carefully. We couldn't find the data yet systematically at the issue of how they married. Social origin is until now still only very partially informed in our database. It's a problem. We don't have the data yet. We should have a look at the data. It's clear. For the pioneers, precisely, it's also your first question. We had information. They were inheritors. Fathers were political figures. In the case of the Bulgarian, 55, she was the daughter of a very, very prominent figure of the Communist Party of Bulgaria. They moved to the Soviet Union in the 20s. And those ones, they are not conservative at all. I don't think we can say they are conservative. This issue of conservatism really relates to the modern, as they say, debate on monetary policy in independent central banks. You should hire a conservative central banker. He doesn't have the same system of preferences as the rest of the population. He will be tougher on inflation and so on. That's not, they were probably seen as a guarantee of something, stability. They were very political. I mean, they were prominent political figures all. And I think they managed to get there because of their really very high level of qualification on practical institutional issues. They were really the ones that really mastered the subject, the topic, which was very, very tricky, very difficult. In the case of Kukov, she had to manage a new currency. It's like the birth of the euro in a context which is not at all the same. It's a Soviet part of Germany, occupied by the Soviet, basically before they became independent, not so independent nation. So very particular case. And I think practical issues were very central. They were very qualified. They had doctorates. They were seen as also, they were resistance. I mean, the issue of the resistance was, for the three, was very important. They were all part of the big picture of history, global history in this sense. So the pioneers, they are completely atypical compared to the ones that arrive after 2000, I would say. And even in the 90s, Schaumeier, she's quite classical. In Austria, she's a banker. She has a profile which is, well, she's not exactly an insider. She's a private banker. But I think with a very high qualification in accounting and financial technicalities, which at that time, beginning of the 90s, was less about theoretical economics, monetary abstract things and so on, a bit more probably closer to accounting or that kind of qualification, where women were excellent, actually, were overrepresented. So I would say that. I would not say that the pioneers were conservative, except probably one thing, probably being in charge of currency, of money, etc., necessitates to be reliable in some sense, some matter, and probably they were seen as more reliable. But we completely lack historical studies. About Kukov, there are biographies that we have read, especially Aikis. She read the biography of Kukov in English, but we should investigate that. And we lack here data, information for the Bulgarian central banker. It's very difficult if you don't read Bulgarian. You don't have any source, so you need to read Bulgarian, That's not evident to enter this global history, but we think it's relevant. Maybe there are cases before of a woman having to deal with issues relating to money, but we didn't find. They were the first ones we found. Finally, for the ECB, the ECB is a complex setting. You have two levels. You have the level of the executive board, where people who are there, they are, including the president, they are appointed at the federal level of Europe, okay? But the others, they are the governors of each national central bank. It's like the Fed in a sense, but here the system, it's called the European System of Central Banks, is federal. So each central bank each government appoints a governor in each country, each member state, to become the head of the central bank. So the French is Villeroy-de-Galhau, for example, at the moment, and they compose together, executive board 6%, and the 20 member states, they compose the governing council. And so there are, of course, negotiations. When the members of the executive board, there is the issue, should we appoint an Italian because Italy is a big country? Is it normal that there is an Italian among the 6? And the answer is often yes, there should be an Italian. It's the way it's the way it works in Europe. Should there be a German or should there be a French is no question. There is obviously at least one French and one German in the executive board. It's an obligation for the ECB. Things like that. And you have a lot of bargain all the time in Europe. I mean, when Draghi saved the euro, he had to bargain with the IMF even, because the IMF was in the picture with Greece, with the Commission, of course. So it was an institutional bargain inside the European institutions. And at the same time, you have the member states with the governments. So it's a very, very complex multi-level game, which we study. There is an entire field of research called European Studies. I'm a bit part of it with my colleagues, but I'm not a specialist of that. And I can tell you it's very complex to understand really how a decision is made. And as now, of course, the archives are not, we don't have the archives, you know, and interviews are really not not always the best solution. To have insiders is best. So for example, Didier Georgakakis, with whom I work, his wife is working at the Commission. He has internal contacts. He has a lot of information from the inside. And in central banks, that would be a help to have more insiders participating to our research, because we have had a lot of interactions with central bankers, but that remains a bit superficial, we think. And there is a history with a PhD student of mine working at Frankfurt at the ECB. He issued a trial against the ECB after 2 years of his research, so that's not the best way to finish a thesis. You know, he didn't finish his thesis. He was in conflict with the institution. It's very complex to work on central banks. You have to prepare to be in a very particular subsector of reality. That's it. Unfortunately, I don't have so much information about social origin. It's that classical critique of posopography at the international level. It's very difficult to get the information. Sometimes that's a problem. We want to deal with that. We want to get information, and about who are they married with and so on. It's quite difficult. It's quite difficult.
Gente, bom, eu gostaria, evidentemente, de agradecer ao Frédéric por essa exposição tão estimulante. Agradecer a presença de todos até quase 9 horas da noite, não é? Dizer que amanhã de manhã, então, há o encontro híbrido dos líderes de grupo de Bourdieu por todo o Brasil, e à tarde nós temos, né, uma sessão de trabalho também, tá? Que começa às 1h30, né, Michel? Isso, às 1h30. Sim. E amanhã é o último dia do evento. Eu não agradeci no início, mas eu também não sei o nome exato das pessoas que trabalharam no PowerPoint, na tradução, o que, ao menos para mim, ajudou bastante a acompanhar alguns raciocínios. Foi você? Ah! Eu achei que tinha sido alguém do GEBU e eu tinha esquecido de agradecer. Oh. Genial, merci alors. Bom, mas quand même, hein, c'est un travail. E agora estamos todos convidados para ir ao bar Santa Genebra, que eu imagino que todo mundo saiba onde é, menos eu. Mas a gente vai para lá agora. Obrigado, gente. Boa noite.